Hello, welcome to Notable Nobels, a podcast about the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. My name is Harrison Doolin. I'm a postdoctoral scientist at the Fred Hutch Cancer Center in Seattle, and I will be your host for this web series. The purpose of this series is to trace key advancements made in the biological and medical sciences over the past 120 to 150 years or so, and we're using the Nobel Prizes in Physiology or Medicine as a guide. Now, every career has its highest prize, and for scientists, that prize is the Nobel Prize. It's the most prestigious award a scientist can receive, and it marks discoveries that have made a profound impact on our understanding of biology and our ability to treat diseases. Now, last episode wrapped up Season 1 of this podcast, which covered the Nobel Prizes in Physiology or Medicine related to infectious diseases. But before we start Season 2, I'm doing this special episode about what is the Nobel Prize. So far we've talked about specific prizes, but we haven't covered the history of the prize itself. So today we'll go over the founding of the prize by Alfred Nobel, what the different Nobel Prizes are and who awards them, what you get if you win the prize, demographics of the prize winners, and we'll end with some comments about the future of the Nobel Prize. So let's start at the beginning. Very often, you will hear the Nobel Prizes referred to incorrectly as the Nobel Prizes. The prizes are the Nobel Prizes, that's N-O-B-E-L, not Noble, N-O-B-L-E. And they are named the Nobel Prizes after the founder of the prize, Alfred Nobel. So, who was Alfred Nobel, and how and why did he start the Nobel Prizes? Alfred Nobel was born in Stockholm, Sweden in 1833, the third of the four sons of Emanuel and Andrette Nobel. Alfred's father was an engineer and inventor, and his mother came from a wealthy family. After his father's businesses in Sweden suffered losses, his father moved to Russia in 1837, where he opened a weapons factory for the Russian military that manufactured sea mines and other explosives. In 1842, the rest of the Nobel family moved to St. Petersburg, where the children, including Alfred, were given a first-rate education and private tutors. As Alfred grew older, his father sent him abroad to further his studies, particularly in chemistry. Alfred went to Paris in 1850, and it was there that he met an Italian scientist named Ascanio Sobrero. Like Alfred's father, Sobrero was interested in explosives, and 3 years before he met Alfred, Sobrero had invented the highly explosive chemical nitroglycerin. However, Sobrero's experience with nitroglycerin led him to believe the chemical was too dangerous for commercialization. He was quite right to think this. Nitroglycerin is a highly unstable chemical that easily explodes if not handled carefully. Here's a quote about the properties of nitroglycerin. Quote, "Unintentional detonation may ensue when dropped, shaken, lit on fire, rapidly heated, exposed to sunlight and ozone, subjected to sparks and electrical discharges, or roughly handled," unquote. Despite these dangers, Alfred Nobel was intrigued by the idea of harnessing the power of nitroglycerin because its explosive power was far greater than the widely used gunpowder of the day. Alfred returned to Russia, where he entered the family's explosives business, which did a booming trade, pun intended, during the Crimean War between 1853 and 1856. However, when the war was over, business stalled, and Alfred's father decided to return to Sweden in 1863 with his two youngest sons, Alfred and Emil. His two older sons, Ludwig and Robert, stayed in Russia to continue the family business, eventually making big gains in the emerging Russian oil market. Meanwhile in Sweden, Alfred continued working as an inventor and chemist with his father and brother. He maintained his interest in nitroglycerin, including his desire to stabilize the chemical for commercial development. Unfortunately, many of his initial experiments were unsuccessful. In 1864, an explosion at one of the family's factories killed several people, including Alfred's younger brother Emil. Despite this loss, Alfred continued working with nitroglycerin, and in 1866, he succeeded in creating a stable version of the chemical. He discovered that mixing nitroglycerin with a special kind of earth called kieselguhr, or in English diatomaceous earth, could create a paste that was much more stable than the liquid nitroglycerin and yet still maintained its explosive properties. Alfred also invented a detonator and blasting cap for the new material that could be set off by lighting a fuse. Alfred initially sold his new invention under the name Nobel's blasting powder, but soon decided to change the name to dynamite, a word derived from the Greek word for power. So, apart from the founding of the Nobel Prize, Alfred Nobel is most remembered as the man who invented dynamite. The invention was soon being used on multiple continents and over 20 countries in mining and construction operations, and it turned Alfred Nobel into one of the richest men in the world. Despite being extremely rich, Alfred Nobel never married and had no children. His health in his later years was not great, and he suffered from heart trouble. Alfred Nobel died in 1896 following a stroke at the age of 63. To the surprise of many, when his will was opened, it was discovered that almost all of his considerable wealth was to be put aside for the creation of a special fund. Here are the words from the will of Alfred Nobel describing the purpose of this fund. Quote, "The whole of my remaining realizable estate shall be disposed of in the following way. The capital invested in safe securities by my executors shall constitute a fund, the interest on which shall be annually awarded as prizes to those who, during the preceding year, shall have conferred the greatest benefit on mankind." Unquote. These prizes are, of course, what we now call the Nobel Prizes. Now, many of Alfred's friends and relatives were not at all happy that Alfred had decided to give away almost all his money rather than leave it to them. There was a long legal battle where many parties sought to invalidate the will, noting that it was made only a year before Alfred's death when he had been admittedly in poor health. However, after 4 years of legal maneuvering, the will was validated and the Nobel Foundation was established in Sweden for the execution of Alfred Nobel's vision for the Nobel Prizes. Now you might be wondering what on earth possessed Alfred Nobel that he should dedicate nearly all of his considerable fortune to the creation of the Nobel Prizes. Well, nobody knows for sure why he did it. He was a rather private man, especially after his health issues began, but there is an apocryphal story about why he created the prizes. The story goes that in 1888, Alfred was staying in Paris when he opened the morning paper to see his own obituary written in black and white on the page. Now, as startling as it may have been to realize that people thought he was dead, what was even more surprising was what the people thought about him, because the obituary was not very flattering. One line in particular proclaimed, "Le marchand de la mort est mort," which in English translates to, "The merchant of death is dead." The obituary berated Alfred for his role in developing military weapons and explosives. Now, it turned out that the obituary was meant for Alfred's older brother Ludwig, but Alfred's name had been printed by mistake. The story goes on to say that the obituary shook Alfred and planted in his mind a desire to give his fortune back to humanity upon his death. He created his new will in 1895, 1 year before his death, and once the will was accepted and the Nobel Foundation was established, the very first Nobel Prizes were awarded in 1901. Now let's go into the details of the prizes themselves. What are the different prize categories, and how are the winners selected? Well, Alfred Nobel's will laid out the conditions for awarding the prizes. Here's what he said, quote, "The interest shall be divided into 5 equal parts to be apportioned as follows. 1 part to the person who shall have made the most important discovery or invention in the field of physics, 1 part to the person who shall have made the most important chemical discovery or invention, 1 part to the person who shall have made the most important discovery in the domain of physiology or medicine, 1 part to the person who in the field of literature shall have produced the most outstanding work of an idealistic tendency, and 1 part to the person who shall have done the most or the best work for fraternity between nations and the abolition or reduction of standing armies and the formation and spreading of peace congresses." Now, still quoting, The prizes for physics and chemistry shall be awarded by the Swedish Academy of Sciences, for physiology or medical works by the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, for literature by the Swedish Academy in Stockholm, and for advocates of peace by a committee of 5 persons to be selected by the Norwegian Storting. It is my express wish that in the awarding of the prizes no consideration shall be given to national affiliations of any kind, so that the most worthy shall receive the prize whether he be Scandinavian or not." Unquote. So the will of Alfred Nobel created the 5 categories of Nobel Prizes in physics, chemistry, physiology or medicine, literature, and peace. As the will lays out, the science and literature prizes are awarded by different Swedish academic institutions, while the Peace Prize is awarded by a committee appointed by the Norwegian Parliament. You might be wondering why Alfred Nobel decided to leave the awarding of the Peace Prize to the Norwegian government and not to a Swedish organization like the other prizes. Well, to answer that question, we need to go over a little bit of the history between Sweden and Norway. Now, as an American, this is not something I learned about in school, so a lot of this history was new to me, including the fact that for most of the 19th century, Sweden and Norway were a single country, officially the United Kingdoms of Sweden and Norway. The countries were united in 1814 following the Napoleonic Wars that rocked Europe during the early 19th century. Now, Norway had been under Danish rule, but Denmark had allied with Napoleon against Russia and Great Britain. Sweden, on the other hand, had allied with the coalition opposing Napoleon and was on the winning side of the war when Napoleon was defeated. Sweden's prize for their participation in the war against Napoleon was the annexation of Norway from Denmark. Following a brief revolt against this arrangement by Norwegian nationals, the 2 countries of Sweden and Norway were officially united in 1814. The deal allowed Norway to maintain its own parliament called the Storting, as well as mostly govern its own internal affairs, while the king in Sweden would handle all foreign policy and was the official head of government. This arrangement was in place for all of Alfred Nobel's life, and as far as he was concerned, Sweden and Norway were one country. However, nationalism had been growing in Norway during the later part of the 19th century, and there were calls for Norwegian independence. It's very likely that Alfred Nobel's decision to leave the awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize to the Norwegian government was Alfred's own attempt at smoothing relations between the 2 Scandinavian countries. While this was a nice gesture, it wasn't enough to stop the eventual dissolution of the union between the 2 countries. In 1905, 9 years after Alfred Nobel's death, Norway declared independence from Sweden. Remarkably, and in the true spirit of the Nobel Prizes, the dissolution was resolved peacefully without a single shot being fired by either nation. Since then, Norway has continued to oversee the awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize, which is presented at a ceremony in Oslo each year. Now, some of you who know more about the prizes might have been holding back a question for these last several minutes, particularly since I mentioned that the will of Alfred Nobel established the 5 Nobel Prize categories of physics, chemistry, physiology or medicine, literature, and peace. You might be saying to yourself, wait a minute, aren't there 6 Nobel Prizes? Isn't there a Nobel Prize in economics? Well, if you're thinking that, you are correct. There is a 6th Nobel Prize in economics, but it was not created by the will of Alfred Nobel. The full title of the Nobel Prize in Economics is the Sveriges Riksbank Prize in Economic Sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel, and it was established in 1968. If, like me, you don't speak Swedish, you are probably wondering what the Sveriges Riksbank is. Well, it's the Central Bank of Sweden, and in 1968, to celebrate their 300th anniversary, they created an endowment with the Nobel Foundation for the creation of the Nobel Prize in Economics. While it was not originally part of Alfred Nobel's will, the Nobel Prize in Economics is considered a bona fide Nobel Prize, that is, it is administered by the Nobel Foundation. It is awarded by the Swedish Academy of Sciences, it is presented at the same ceremony as the other Swedish prizes, and it is subject to the same rules and statutes of the Nobel Foundation. Now, perhaps of more relevance to the listeners of this podcast, let's go over the selection process for the winners of the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. So, how is someone chosen as the winner? for the Physiology or Medicine Nobel Prize? Well, there are a few rules for eligibility for the prize. One is that the prize in physiology or medicine is awarded to an individual or individuals, not to an institution. This is true for the other prizes as well, except for the Peace Prize, which can be awarded to an organization. Additionally, the prize is awarded for a specific discovery that has had a major impact on physiology or medicine. So the prize is not a lifetime achievement award. You must have made a specific contribution to physiology or medicine to win the prize. Another rule is that the prize can be shared by no more than 3 people in a given year. And finally, it's a rule that you must be alive to accept the award. The reason for these rules was to try to maintain the spirit of the wishes of Alfred Nobel when he created the prize. You see, Alfred intended for the prize to go to a young, bright scientist who had made a remarkable discovery the previous year, and Alfred hoped that by winning the prize, the scientist would have the financial stability to pursue ambitious scientific questions. Now, we'll talk later about how the prize has kind of drifted away from this original vision, but that's the reason for the rules about the prize going to individuals and being alive to receive the prize. As per the will of Alfred Nobel, the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine is awarded by the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, one of Sweden's main medical universities. A special group of 50 professors in medical disciplines form the Nobel Assembly that votes on who will receive the prize. But before that vote takes place, there is a 12-month nomination process. A committee of 6 members of the Nobel Assembly called the Nobel Committee handles the nomination process. In September, in the year prior to the vote for the Nobel Prize winner, the Nobel Committee sends out confidential letters to competent and qualified scientists asking them to nominate candidates for the Nobel Prize. So who are these scientists? Well, every member of the Nobel Assembly gets to nominate someone, and so do previous Nobel laureates of both the physiology or medicine and chemistry categories. Nominations are also requested from members of Sweden's Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, and beyond that, the committee will solicit nominations from scientists around the world who hold a position of at least full professor at a medical institution. According to the Nobel Foundation's website, this is done, quote, with a view to ensuring the appropriate distribution of the task among various countries, unquote. Beyond that, the committee is also free to ask anyone else they think might be a qualified and competent scientist. Now, one of the rules for the nomination process is that you are not allowed to nominate yourself, and another rule is confidentiality. You are not allowed to tell anyone else who you nominated. And the Nobel Committee is pretty serious about this. The records of the nomination process are sealed for 50 years. Now, the reason given for this is to prevent retaliation against the Nobel Assembly for its ultimate decision in awarding the prize. So because winning a Nobel Prize is such a big deal, you can easily imagine a person being very bitter if they found out they were in the running for a Nobel Prize but missed out. So to prevent any hostility, the nominations and the rest of the selection process are done confidentially. Now, like we said, the invitations to submit a nomination are sent out in September, and the committee sends out over 3,000 invitations to scientists all over the world. The nominators have until January 31st to submit their nominations to the Nobel Committee. Then from March through August, a group of experts selected by the committee from diverse international institutions will write up what are called evaluation reports. These reports are brief summaries of the contributions of the nominees, and they will also contain arguments both for and against the nominee's suitability for the prize. These reports get submitted to the committee. The committee then looks them over and, with their own judgment, selects a short list of candidates for submission to the Nobel Assembly. The committee makes these recommendations in September, and then the Nobel Assembly meets on the first Monday of October to vote to select that year's Nobel Prize winner. The winner is selected by majority vote, and the announcement of the winner is held at a press conference immediately after the vote is finalized. Now, there's a lot of really fun stories here about the day of the announcements. Like we just said earlier, the entire nomination process is confidential, so it's always a surprise to hear that you've won a Nobel Prize. Additionally, there is not a lot of time between when the laureates are selected and when they are announced at the press conference. It's literally a matter of minutes. The Nobel Committee will attempt to contact the winner in those minutes to tell them that they've won the award before the press conference, but prize winners are selected from around the world, and the committee often ends up going to voicemail after failing to contact the prize winner. Here's a few examples of laureates getting the call. Laureates have been, at the time of the announcement, 1. On a plane from Moscow to New York, 2. At a pub in Australia, 3. Teaching a class, 4. Fast asleep, and we had a Nobel laureate backpacking through Idaho. Now, I mentioned the fast asleep one because I live on the west coast of the United States, which has produced a great many Nobel laureates, but it's also 2 a.m. here when the Nobel Prizes are announced in Sweden. So you'll hear lots of stories of people waking up to a flood of calls and text messages from their friends telling them to check the news, you've won a Nobel Prize. Even then, people sometimes at first think they're getting pranked and don't believe it, which, is fair. But it's always a fun time, and the laureates are always smiling broadly when the reporters come up to them and ask, "How did you find out that you won the Nobel Prize?" Now, speaking of a fun time, let's get into the award itself. What exactly do you win when you win a Nobel Prize? Well, there are 3 main things. 1, a gold medal, 2, a diploma, and number 3, personal prize money equivalent to approximately $1 million. The gold medal is made of 175 grams of 18-karat gold and plated with 24-karat gold. On the front of all the medals is an image of Alfred Nobel. On the back is the name of the Nobel laureate and a design specific to the prize category. For the Physiology or Medicine Prize, the design is an image of medicine as a woman with a book in her lap and one arm around a sick girl. In her other hand, medicine collects water from a rock to give to the sick girl. The back of the medal also contains the Latin inscription, Inventas vitam iuvat excluisi per artis. This line is adapted from Virgil's classic The Aeneid, and it loosely translates to, "They who bettered life on earth by newfound mastery." In addition to the solid gold medal, laureates are given 3 replicas of their medal. While they are free to do whatever they want with their replicas, it's become a tradition with at least the Medicine Prize for laureates to give these replicas to academic institutions they have studied or worked at. What happens to the medals after that is up to the institution. For example, here's a rather humorous account from Nobel Prize winner Michael Bishop describing what happened to his replicas. Quote, "I donated my replicas to the 3 institutions of higher education where I had studied, Gettysburg College, Harvard Medical School, and the University of California, San Francisco, where they have met diverse fates. Gettysburg College displays its copy at the entrance to the campus library, UCSF has yet to give its copy a permanent residence, and Harvard has presumably added its copy to a drawer bulging with others." Unquote. Now, the diplomas that are presented with the award are designed by each of the separate awarding institutions, but share some common features. The diploma is presented in a leather binding with a different color leather for each of the different prizes. The diploma itself is handwritten in Swedish by a selected calligraphy artist and includes the name of the prize winner, as well as a brief citation explaining why the awarding institution selected them for the prize. It used to be that the diploma was decorated with a piece of art made with specific reference to the prize winner, but unfortunately for the prize in Physiology or Medicine, they've stopped making these individualized diplomas. The diploma instead now contains a relief of the Nobel Prize medal. The diplomas are very pretty to look at, and you can see a selection of them on the Nobel Prize Foundation's website. Okay, now let's talk about the money. 11 million Swedish kronar, or about $1 million, is awarded for each full prize. This is not grant money. This is personal prize money, so the laureate is free to spend their winnings however they want. But individual winners often don't walk away with the full $1 million. The science prizes can be awarded to up to 3 people, and laureates split the money if it goes to more than one person. The money does not have to be split evenly. Sometimes the awarding institution will award half of the prize to one individual and the other half of the prize to 2 individuals. Usually this is for the separate contributions people have made to their field. In addition to possibly having to split the money with your fellow laureates, you may also need to split the money with your government. In the United States, your Nobel Prize winnings count as taxable income at the federal level and possibly the state level depending on where you live. But even after having to go through all of that, laureates still end up with a nice chunk of cash. And they've chosen to spend that money on a wide variety of things. Some have used it to support their own research, some have given it to their family and children, some have used it to start new scholarships for underrepresented groups in science, some have donated it to universities that have supported their research, some have started new scientific foundations, some have given it to religious and cultural institutions like churches and synagogues, and some decided to treat themselves to new motorbikes and croquet lawns. So that's the sum of what you receive if you win a Nobel Prize, but the prize isn't just something the Nobel Foundation ships you in the mail. Oh, no. The presentation of the Nobel Prize is done with a legendary amount of pomp and circumstance. It's often been described as something out of a fairy tale, and with good reason. The Swedes go all out in celebrating the Nobel Prize winners. When the prize winners are notified of their new position as Nobel laureate in the beginning of October, they are also invited to Stockholm for the Nobel Prize award ceremony, which takes place every year on December 10th, the anniversary of Alfred Nobel's death. But the ceremony is just the pinnacle of an entire week of events and festivities referred to as Nobel Week. One key event during this week is the Nobel Prize lectures. Each prize winner is required to give a talk about their research at the different prize-giving institutions. And these talks are great snapshots of the work being done in specific fields of science. In addition to the formal lectures, the week also features roundtable-style talks with laureates, as well as press conferences and interviews. Each laureate is also invited to the Nobel Museum in Stockholm, where they can donate something related to their research that is then added to the museum's collection. There is also a classical music concert and lights show for people to enjoy, plus the many delights of the Christmas season in Stockholm. But the main affair of the week falls on December 10th, which contains the prize ceremony, followed by a banquet. The event is really like a ball straight out of Cinderella. Everyone is dressed to the nines, men in white tie and evening dress, the women in ball gowns. Laureates are assigned a valet for the length of their stay to help them with the dress code and ceremonial rules. The ceremony for all the prizes except the Peace Prize is at the Stockholm Concert Hall. Since the Peace Prize is awarded in Norway, the ceremony for the Peace Prize is held in Oslo at the Oslo City Hall. The Stockholm Concert Hall is decorated with flowers and hosts a full orchestra for the ceremony. On stage sit the laureates and other dignitaries, most prominently the King of Sweden and the royal family. A bust of Alfred Nobel sits center stage. Now, with much pomp and circumstance, the winners receive their diploma and medal from the hand of the King of Sweden, and following the ceremony, everyone moves to the Stockholm City Hall for the banquet. This is an enormous affair that typically hosts over 1,300 guests. The guests include the Nobel laureates as the guests of honor, of course, as well as their immediate families, and laureates may bring up to 12 additional guests to the ceremony and banquet. Guests also include the Swedish royal family, members of the Swedish government, previous Nobel Prize winners, and representatives from scientific institutions from around the world. Dinner is 3 courses of Scandinavian-inspired food and features many toasts and short speeches from the Nobel laureates. The evening concludes with dancing in a nearby ballroom, and it can go on well into the night. But the week is not over yet for the Nobel laureates. The evening following the Nobel banquet, the laureates are hosted by the King and Queen of Sweden for dinner at the Royal Palace in Stockholm. This is a quieter affair from the previous evening, though still hosting about 100 guests, and it retains all the extravagance of the previous evening. Following these formal events, laureates will often take time to explore more of Stockholm before heading back home, concluding what for many has been a once-in-a-lifetime week of wonder. Can you tell I want to go? Well, maybe someday. So that's what a typical year of Nobel Prize winning looks like, but what about atypical years? Has there ever been a year when the Nobel Prizes weren't given out? Well, yes. The statutes of the Nobel Prize Foundation allow the prizes to go unawarded if a suitable candidate cannot be found or in the presence of extraordinary circumstances. The Physiology or Medicine Prize was not awarded on 9 occasions, the most notable being a stretch from 1915 to 1918 and a second stretch from 1940 to 1942. As you might have guessed from the dates, this was during World War I and World War II, which proved disruptive enough to prevent the prizes from being awarded. There were also occasions when the prizes were awarded, but no ceremony was held. For example, while the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded in 1944, no ceremony was held due to the Nazi occupation of Norway, which would normally award the Peace Prize and host the ceremony. More recently, the Nobel Prize ceremony was cancelled in 2020 and 2021 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Prizes were still awarded for those years, but rather than the massive gatherings typical of Nobel Week, laureates were given their medals in small ceremonies in their home countries. In 2022, the Nobel Foundation decided to make it up to the laureates who missed out and hosted the winners from 2020, 2021, and 2022. I will say some Nobel laureates were actually okay with missing out. Charlie Rice, for example, who won the 2020 prize in physiology or medicine, said that since he's the quiet, shy scientist type, he'd have been happy to do the whole thing on Zoom. He did end up going to the 2022 ceremony, though. But that sort of segues us into our next topic. What are the Nobel Prize winners like? Like, who are these people? What are their backgrounds, their demographics? Who tends to win the Nobel Prize? Well, it might not surprise you to learn that the vast majority of Nobel Prize winners in the sciences have been men, since historically women were excluded from practicing science. Women make up only about 3% of Nobel Prize winners in the sciences, and in the entire 20th century, only 10 women won Nobel Prizes in the science categories. Now, since the start of the 21st century, 15 women have won Nobel Prizes for discoveries in science, so we are likely to see more prizes going to women in the years to come. Apart from men, there are other groups that are highly overrepresented among Nobel laureates. One group is Jews. Despite making up only about 0.2% of the world's population, Jews represent approximately 20% of Nobel Prize winners. This has led some people to speculate that perhaps there is something special about the Jewish heritage or religion that is constructive to winning a Nobel Prize. However, Jewish Nobel laureates are also part of another demographic that is overrepresented among Nobel laureates. That demographic is immigrants. Here it's worth focusing our attention on the United States. The US has produced over 50% of all Nobel Prize winners. Despite immigrants making up only about 15% of the U.S. population, approximately 35% of U.S. Nobel Prize winners have been immigrants, and 40% of 21st century U.S. prize winners have been immigrants. So why this overrepresentation? Well, this is due in part to America's history of investing heavily in scientific research, and also in part to its welcoming international talent to come work and study at U.S. institutions. For a long time, the U.S. enjoyed robust government support for research that helped turn U.S. universities and institutions into the best in the world. This attracted talented individuals who often decided to stay here after completing their studies. Apart from enjoying the material benefits these scientists produced, such as novel medicines and technologies, the U.S. has also, as a byproduct, enjoyed a wealth of Nobel Prize winners. It's worth pointing out here that the US is in the process of actively deconstructing the very institutions that have given it such high standing in Nobel Prize circles. Visa restrictions and dramatic changes to government scientific funding have led many people to wonder if the US will continue to play an outsized role in future Nobel Prize ceremonies. But the large share of immigrant Nobel Prize winners suggests that creating an open environment where people and ideas are free to move around and congregate may be an important part in the production of Nobel Prize winning research. Another factor among Nobel Prize winners is age. The youngest recipient for the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine was 31, and the oldest was 87. The current average sits at 58 years old at the time of the award, and it's going up. That being said, most Nobel Prize winners were in their 30s or 40s when they made the discovery that won them their award. So why this gap between when the discovery was made and when the laureates received their prize? Well, it can sometimes take a long time from when a discovery is made to when that discovery has significant impact that brings it to global attention. And sometimes initial discoveries are dependent on further research before that discovery results in what Alfred Nobel called the greatest benefit on mankind. So there's this on average 20-year gap between when a laureate makes their discovery and when they are awarded their prize. And that gap keeps getting bigger as laureates get older and older. Now, before older listeners of this podcast get bummed out and think to themselves, oh, I'll never make a major contribution to my field because I'm so old, we should point out that while it's true that Nobel Prize winners make their discoveries relatively early in their careers, the Nobel Prize is biased towards rewarding these early career discoveries. This is because one of the qualifications for receiving the prize is that you must be alive at the time of the award. So the reality is that you can still make a breakthrough discovery, even later in your career, and great science can be done by both the very young and the very old. Going back to our question, who tends to win the Nobel Prize? Well, there's one obvious thing we haven't mentioned yet. Nobel Prize winners are good scientists. But what does being a good scientist look like, and how do you become one? Well, if you want to be a good scientist, you should start by getting a good scientist to train you. And if you want to be a Nobel Prize-winning scientist, you should have a Nobel Prize-winning scientist train you. One thing that stands out among Nobel Prize winners in the sciences is their connectedness to each other. In the great science family tree, over 95% of Nobel laureates in the science and economic prizes can claim a connection to another prize winner. This is either as a teacher, a mentor of a mentor, or a collaborator. Mentor-mentee relationships and collaboration play a key role in how science is done and how science is taught. So if you want to be a Nobel Prize-winning scientist, get connected to a notable Nobel. You won't be able to just ride their coattails, though. You'll need to be pretty productive in your own right. And what does productivity look like for a scientist? Well, it means publishing scientific papers. Prior to winning their award, Nobel Prize-winning scientists publish papers at a much higher rate than other scientists, especially in the 10 years leading up to when they are awarded their prize. Curiously, productivity tends to decline among Nobel Prize winners after they win the award. This is not just because they're getting older. One study found productivity among Nobel Prize winners dropped significantly compared to age-matched winners of another prominent but not as prestigious award, the Lasker Award. So what's going on? Well, the authors of the study pointed out that winning a Nobel Prize usually propels you into the limelight, which takes you away from the labor-intensive activity of doing research. Here's a quote from their paper. Quote, "Producing innovative and influential research output demands considerable time, effort, and focus. The Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine provides a platform to serve as ambassadors for science. Laureates often step onto this platform, replacing time in the laboratory with time leading communities and institutions, serving on government and professional bodies, and writing books and delivering talks for general audiences." Unquote. So while we may be surprised by the finding that Nobel laureates end up doing less science after they win the prize, their science advocacy after winning the prize can potentially have a ripple effect that results in more science being done overall. Before we wrap things up today, I want to cover the question, what will the future of the Nobel Prize look like? For starters, let's ask the question, will we get a new Nobel Prize? It happened once already with the creation of the Nobel Prize in Economics, so it's possible it could happen again. We can only speculate, though, as to what this new Nobel Prize category would be, and I'm unfortunately too siloed into the biomedical sciences to make a prediction about this. But what I can predict is that we can expect the Nobel Prize to continue to hold a great deal of sway in scientific and public circles for the foreseeable future. I guess we should also expect Nobel Prize winners to continue to be older. The average age of Nobel laureates has slowly been increasing for decades, and it probably will continue to do so, though it should plateau at some point. We already mentioned that women are likely to make up a greater share of Nobel Prize winners in the future. We've already seen more women scientist Nobel Prize winners this century than there were in the entire 20th century, and as women continue to enter the scientific workforce, we can expect more women to win Nobel Prizes. We can also expect future Nobel Prize winners to come from new scientific powerhouses, particularly those in East Asia. To date, only one Chinese national has won the Physiology or Medicine Prize, and the same is true for the Chemistry Prize. That will almost certainly change as China continues to expand its research presence both domestically and internationally. We should add that this represents changes not just in increased scientific funding for building new universities in China, but also cultural changes taking place. We talked briefly about cultural differences between East and West back on episode 23 of this podcast, but to recap, the very premise of the Nobel Prize is indicative of a Western mindset that promotes the individual as opposed to an Eastern mindset that tends to be much more collective. In an extreme example of this, under Maoist China, researchers were not allowed to publish their work under their own name, but only as part of a government-approved scientific collective. However, in recent decades, China and other East Asian countries have shifted to adopt more Western-style scientific institutions that highlight individual investigators. For instance, in 2024, China opened the National Museum for Modern Chinese Scientists in Beijing, which includes the stories of individual scientists who contributed to China's scientific development. So as China continues to develop both culturally and economically, we can probably expect to see more Chinese Nobel laureates in the years to come. Another demographic shift that has been playing out specifically in the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine is the role of physician scientists. Medical practitioners used to make up the vast majority of Nobel Prize winners in physiology or medicine. A paper published in 2011 showed that in the first 30 years of Nobel Prizes, over 79% of laureates in physiology or medicine were clinicians. That's dropped to less than 25% in recent decades. The reasons for this are complicated. One factor is that the percentage of medical doctors who also conduct research has been steadily declining as doctors and hospitals turn their focus to the profit-making tasks of medicine over medical research. Another factor is that there is simply way more information to learn in order to be a physician scientist, so the task is extremely daunting. A third factor highlights the shifting role of physician scientists in recent decades. While physician scientists used to be heavily involved in fundamental science questions, many are now involved in what we call translational scientific research, which moves basic science discoveries into clinical trials and approved drugs. While these people are not involved in making the groundbreaking discovery that can result in a Nobel Prize, their work is critical in the process of converting discoveries into benefits for mankind. Without them, Nobel Prize-winning discoveries would not be properly recognized. This has led some people to call for more Nobel Prize recognition of physician scientists and others involved in translational research. I don't really see this happening anytime soon, The Nobel Prize recognizes an initial discovery or breakthrough in science, and often the translational steps that bring that breakthrough from the bench to the bedside don't involve new discoveries, but the adaptation of existing techniques. That being said, I think it's right to recognize the work of physician scientists and translational scientists, and we should do more to make space for physician scientists in the workforce. The question of recognizing translational research leads to another broader question about the future of the Nobel Prizes. Namely, how can we select an individual for a Nobel Prize as science in the modern age gets more and more collaborative? In other words, is the Nobel Prize wrong for limiting the award to just 3 people, when in reality it takes many teams of people working together to produce a new discovery? Alfred Nobel created the prize back when it was much easier for a lone researcher working in a lab somewhere to make a revolutionary discovery. But that is not how most modern scientific research is done. So should we update the Nobel Prize to recognize that most modern science is collaborative? It's a difficult question to answer, and also goes back to the differences we saw between Eastern and Western mindsets. Western culture tends to emphasize the individual, while Eastern culture tends to emphasize the collective. So who's right when it comes to giving credit for a discovery? I think they are both right to some extent. Even when we rightly say that no man is an island and it takes a village, it's also often true that some individuals will play an outsized role in driving the work forward. So is there a way the Nobel Prizes might better show this dichotomy? Well, one proposal is to remove the current practice of concealing Nobel Prize nominations for 50 years. Remember, we said this was done to prevent retaliation by people who miss out on a prize. But let's think about it for a minute. Other major prizes release the nomination list, and this actually helps the nominees without hurting the winners. Think about the Academy Award for Motion Pictures, otherwise known as the Oscars. Movies that don't win Oscars can still advertise that they were nominated for an Oscar, and because the Oscars are such a big deal, this is enough attention to result in increased viewership of a movie, even if it doesn't win. Now, the Nobel Prize holds similar power in the sense that it is so well known that even being nominated for one of the science prizes is a huge recognition from your scientific peers that you are doing excellent science. Releasing the names of nominees, even if they don't win, could boost careers of younger scientists and better showcase the wide range of excellent scientists that nevertheless miss out on the top prize. Now, for my part, I don't think we're going to see the 50-year rule changed, in part because unlike the Oscars, people that don't win a Nobel Prize one year can still be nominated again next year for the same discovery. So it's not like missing out on the prize one year means you are out of the running. So rather than change the Nobel Prize, what I think we should do to better promote great science is to have more prizes and more coverage of the great things people are doing. There are lots of other prizes similar to the Nobel Prize, though without the same level of prestige. For example, in the US, we have the Lasker Award and the Breakthrough Prizes. These are great ways to honor great science, and better popularizing these prizes could do a lot to promote up-and-coming scientists. And even if someone doesn't have stacks of cash available to create a new prize, popularizing and promoting science is something anyone can do, including you and me. And that promotion could well be what turns a passing discovery into a breakthrough discovery. Okay, one final thing to mention before we wrap up this episode. In case you haven't noticed, I'm a big fan of the Nobel Prize. I love how it popularizes science, and I love researching the discoveries scientists have made and seeing how they made an impact. But it's worth mentioning that you should not make an idol out of the Nobel Prize. In his book Losing the Nobel Prize, physicist Brian Keating compares the Nobel Prize to the golden calf in the Bible's book of Exodus. For those of you unfamiliar with the story, it takes place not long after God leads Moses and the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt. The Israelites, after not hearing from God and Moses for a while, decide they want to make a new God for themselves, so they melt down their gold to craft a statue in the shape of a golden calf for themselves. They are rebuked for their idolatry by Moses, who calls them out for worshipping something made by human hands. Keating states in his book that in his experience, scientists need to be reminded that the Nobel Prize is nothing more than a man-made object, and it should not be an object of worship. In other words, scientists shouldn't make winning a Nobel Prize their ultimate goal for doing science. Here's an excerpt from Keating's book. Quote, "Perhaps we're done with coveting our neighbor's donkeys, but idol worship is deeply rooted in human nature, and human nature hasn't changed much in the past few millennia. Looking at my brush with the actual Nobel Prize, I realized that modern man is not so far removed from the exalters of Bull and Baal in centuries past. What do physicists venerate in our modern age? There is Nobel." Unquote. So let's not be like the Israelites who exchanged worshipping the real God for a golden medal one, even if it has Alfred Nobel's face on the front. Okay, that concludes this special episode of Notable Nobels. This episode was recorded on October 10th, 2025. I want to thank Digital Mind Productions for providing the music, and Nicholas Wynn for the graphic design. Next time on Notable Nobels, we will be kicking off Season 2 of this podcast, which will cover Nobel Prizes awarded for discoveries in immunology. Immunology is the study of the immune system, which involves your body's defenses against disease. Primarily, it's the study of how your body defends itself against invasion from harmful pathogens. We'll be going back over 100 years ago in our next episode to the two fathers of immunology. Want to know more? Well, listen next time to find out. Thanks so much for listening. See you then.